There are places on Earth where darkness is not merely the absence of light, but something that presses against you, thick and alive. Mammoth Cave in Kentucky is one such place. Stretching over 400 miles beneath the rolling hills of south-central Kentucky, it is the longest-known cave system in the world. Tourists descend its stone staircases every day, marveling at cathedral-sized chambers and limestone formations that took millennia to form. But some visitors hear things the guided tours never mention. Voices that echo from tunnels long sealed off, footsteps that follow just out of sight, whispers that seem to know your name. The rangers don't talk about it openly. The official literature never mentions the letters they receive, the incident reports filed away in locked cabinets, or the guides who refuse to work certain sections after dark. But the stories persist. They always have. Long before this place became a national park, before electric lights illuminated its passages, people who ventured into Mammoth Cave spoke of presences in the dark, of something that watches, something that waits. Mammoth Cave sits in Edmonson County, Kentucky, carved by an ancient underground river system over millions of years. The Green River flows above much of it, but below ground, water has sculpted a labyrinth of passages, chambers, and shafts that plunge hundreds of feet into the earth. The cave system is so vast that new sections are still being discovered. Geologists estimate that only a fraction of its total extent has been mapped. Humans first entered these passages over 4,000 years ago. Evidence of archaic and woodland period Native Americans has been found deep within the cave. They mined gypsum and mirabilite, leaving behind torch marks on walls and the mummified remains of those who never made it back out. One of the most famous is a man the archaeologists call Lost John, a pre-Columbian miner whose body was discovered in 1935, crushed beneath a boulder in a narrow passage 5 miles from any entrance. He had been there for over 2,000 years. His sandals were still on his feet. The indigenous peoples who lived near the cave spoke of it with reverence and fear. Shawnee legends described it as a place where the boundary between worlds grew thin, where spirits of the dead could be heard calling to the living. They believed certain passages led to the underworld itself, and that to go too deep was to risk never returning. When European settlers arrived in the late 1700s, they found the cave already steeped in folklore. Some of that folklore, it turns out, was well-deserved. In 1812, a saltpeter miner named Houchins rediscovered the cave while chasing a wounded bear. The animal had fled into a sinkhole entrance, and Houchins followed. What he found inside astonished him. Vast chambers stretched into the darkness, some large enough to hold entire buildings. The potential for mining was immediately recognized. During the War of 1812, crews extracted calcium nitrate to produce gunpowder, working by torchlight in conditions that would be considered impossibly dangerous by modern standards. It was during this period that the first documented strange occurrences began to appear in letters and journals. Miners reported hearing voices in sections of the cave where no one else was working. Tools would go missing and reappear days later in places already searched. One foreman wrote of a distinct feeling of being watched whenever he worked in a particular passage, a sensation so strong that he eventually refused to enter it alone. He described it as a presence, not hostile, but intensely aware. He left the mining operation entirely after 6 months. By the 1832nd, Mammoth Cave had gained a new, grimmer purpose. Dr. John Croghan purchased the property in 1839 and attempted to use it as a tuberculosis hospital. The theory, popular at the time, was that the cave's constant temperature and humidity would benefit patients suffering from the disease. He built wooden huts inside one of the larger chambers and brought in patients, some paying, others desperate. The experiment was a catastrophic failure. Within a year, several patients had died and the survivors were evacuated. But what happened during those months remains one of the strangest chapters in the cave's history. Nurses reported that patients would wake in the night claiming to hear singing, faint and distant, coming from deeper in the cave. Some said the voices sounded like hymns, others described them as wordless, haunting melodies that seemed to rise and fall like breathing. One patient, a schoolteacher named Margaret Hawkins, kept a diary during her stay. In it, she wrote about a recurring dream in which she walked through the cave and encountered a man dressed in old-fashioned mining clothes. He never spoke, but he gestured for her to follow him deeper into the darkness. Each time she refused, and each time she woke feeling an overwhelming sadness, as though she had abandoned someone in need. She died in the cave in 1842. Her diary was found among her belongings and later donated to the local historical society. After the hospital closed, Mammoth Cave became a tourist attraction. By the 1,850 seconds, guides were leading paying visitors through its passages by lamplight. One of the most famous guides was Stephen Bishop, an enslaved man who became the cave's chief explorer. He discovered miles of new passages, including the route to what is now called Bishop's Avenue. He drew maps, named formations, and became something of a celebrity among visitors. But Bishop also spoke, cautiously, about experiences he could not explain. In an 1856 interview preserved in a Louisville newspaper, Bishop mentioned that certain areas of the cave felt different. He described one passage near what is now called the Snowball Room, where the air seemed heavier, where sounds behaved strangely. He said that more than once, while exploring alone, he had heard footsteps behind him in tunnels he knew to be empty. When he turned, there was nothing, just the dark, pressing close. Bishop died in 1857 at the age of 37, likely from tuberculosis contracted during his years in the cave. He is buried in the Old Guides Cemetery near the historic entrance. His grave is one of the most visited spots in the park. Some claim that on quiet evenings, you can still hear the sound of footsteps on the trail leading to his resting place, even when no one is there. The early 20th century brought electric lighting and more extensive commercialization. Rival cave systems competed for tourist dollars, leading to the so-called Kentucky Cave Wars, a bizarre period of aggressive marketing, sabotage, and even alleged kidnappings. But Mammoth remained the crown jewel. In 1941, it became a national park, and its passages were opened to the public under federal oversight. It was also during this period that park rangers began keeping unofficial records of unusual incidents. These were not official reports, nothing that would appear in safety logs or public documents, but rather notes passed between staff, warnings about certain areas. One section, a passage called the Corkscrew, developed a reputation among guides. Visitors would frequently report feeling dizzy or nauseous when passing through it, even those with no history of claustrophobia. Some claimed to hear whispering, though no words could be made out. In 1955, a ranger named Thomas Ridley was leading a small tour group through a section known as Fat Man's Misery, a narrow, twisting passage that requires visitors to squeeze between rock walls. The group consisted of 6 people, including a married couple from Ohio. As they moved through the passage, the wife suddenly stopped and refused to go any further. She told Ridley that she could hear someone calling her name from deeper in the cave. Her husband heard nothing, neither did anyone else in the group. Ridley, assuming she was experiencing a panic attack, offered to escort her back to the main chamber. But as they retraced their steps, he heard it too. A voice, faint but distinct, calling out what sounded like a name, not the woman's name, but another. He couldn't make it out clearly. The acoustics in the cave can be deceptive, he later wrote in his notes, but this was different. It felt directed, it felt intentional. The woman and her husband left the tour early. Ridley continued leading groups through that section for several more months, but he never forgot the incident. He retired from the Park Service in 1973 and moved to Florida. In a letter to a former colleague in 1981, he admitted that he still sometimes dreamed about that voice and that he had never been able to shake the feeling that something in the cave had been trying to communicate. By the 1970s, Mammoth Cave had become one of the most studied cave systems in the world. Geologists, biologists, and archaeologists flocked to it, but so did a different kind of researcher. Parapsychologists began taking an interest, drawn by the accumulating reports of strange phenomena. In 1977, a team from the University of Louisville conducted an informal investigation, spending 3 nights camping in one of the deeper chambers. They brought audio recording equipment, hoping to capture evidence of the voices visitors had reported. They recorded over 40 hours of audio. Most of it was unremarkable: the drip of water, the rustle of their own movements, the occasional distant rumble of a tour group passing through a nearby section. But on the second night, their equipment picked up something else: a series of faint, rhythmic sounds that one researcher described as resembling footsteps. The sounds continued for nearly 10 minutes, moving from one side of the chamber to the other, then stopping abruptly. When they reviewed the footage later, they noticed something odd. The sounds appeared on the recording, but none of the 3 researchers present recalled hearing them at the time. One of them, a graduate student named Laura Finch, wrote in her report that the experience left her unsettled. She described feeling an intense, unexplainable cold in the chamber that night, despite the cave's constant 54-degree temperature. She never returned to Mammoth Cave. The university chose not to publish the findings. The recordings were archived, and the project was quietly shelved. But word spread. By the 1980s, Mammoth Cave had developed a reputation in paranormal circles. It was featured in several books on haunted places, often alongside more sensational accounts that blurred the line between fact and fiction. The Park Service, understandably, was not thrilled with this attention. They emphasized the cave's scientific and historical significance, downplaying any supernatural associations, but the reports continued. In 1983, a group of spelunkers exploring a restricted section of the cave claimed to have seen a figure standing at the far end of a passage. They described it as humanoid but indistinct, visible only for a moment before vanishing. When they reached the spot where it had been, there was nothing. No footprints in the soft mud, no signs that anyone had been there. One of the spelunkers, a man named David Forrester, later gave an interview to a local newspaper. He admitted that he had been skeptical of ghost stories his entire life, but what he saw in the cave changed his perspective. He described the figure as motionless, silent, and profoundly unsettling. He said it felt less like seeing a person and more like seeing the memory of a person, something caught between states. In 1991, the cave gained international attention when a connection was discovered between Mammoth and the nearby Roppel Cave system, adding over 60 miles to the known length. The discovery required years of dangerous exploration, with teams crawling through flooded passages and squeezing through gaps barely wide enough for a human body. It was during one of these expeditions that explorer Patricia Crowther reported an experience she later described as the most frightening of her life. Crowther was navigating a tight crawl space, alone and far from the rest of her team, when her headlamp flickered and went out. She was plunged into absolute darkness, the kind that exists only underground, where no light has ever reached. She fumbled for her backup light, but before she could activate it, she heard breathing. Not her own, someone else's, close, right next to her ear. She switched on the backup light. There was no one there. She was alone in a passage so narrow she could barely move, but the sound had been unmistakable. She could still feel the warmth of breath on her neck. She radioed her team and made her way back to the surface as quickly as she could. She completed several more expeditions in Mammoth Cave after that, but she never went into that particular passage again. The Park Service has always maintained that the cave is safe, that the phenomena visitors report can be explained by natural causes. Acoustics in the cave are complex. Sound can travel long distances, bending around corners, echoing in ways that create the illusion of voices or footsteps. The constant darkness and isolation can play tricks on the mind. People hear what they expect to hear, see what they expect to see. And yet, the reports persist. In 2003, a ranger named Ellis Grant filed an incident report after a tour group in the frozen Niagara section became agitated. Several members claimed to see movement in a side passage, shadows shifting just beyond the reach of the tour lights. Grant investigated and found nothing. But when he returned to the group, one of the visitors, a woman from Tennessee, asked him if the park employed actors to enhance the experience. She insisted she had seen someone standing in the passage, watching them. Grant assured her they did not. The woman was not satisfied with his answer. She described the figure in detail: tall, wearing what looked like old work clothes, standing perfectly still. She said the figure's face was obscured, but she could feel its gaze. 2 other members of the group corroborated her account. Grant finished the tour without further incident, but he made a note in his report. The passage the woman described was not accessible to the public. It had been sealed off years earlier due to safety concerns. Some of the most compelling accounts come from the cave's support staff, the maintenance workers and technicians, who spend hours alone in the tunnels, far from tourist routes. In 2007, an electrician named Marcus Hill was repairing a lighting system in a section called the Grand Avenue when he heard singing. He described it as a woman's voice, clear and melodic, echoing from somewhere deeper in the cave. He followed the sound for several minutes, convinced that someone from another tour group had wandered off. The singing stopped abruptly. Hill found himself in a small chamber he didn't recognize, one not marked on his map. He radioed back to the surface, asking if there were any other workers in the area. There were not. He was alone. He retraced his steps and never found the chamber again. When he described it to other staff members, no one could identify it based on his description. It is possible he took a wrong turn, that he became disoriented. But Hill was experienced. He had worked in the cave for over a decade. He knew its passages well. In 2012, the park installed a network of motion-activated cameras in several remote sections, part of a wildlife monitoring project. The cameras were designed to capture images of cave-adapted species, rare animals that live their entire lives in the darkness. Over the course of a year, the cameras recorded thousands of images. Most showed nothing unusual. Bats, crickets, the occasional blind fish in pools of standing water. But 3 images, taken over the span of 6 months in a passage known as the Violet City Lantern Tour Route, showed something else. In each image, a blurred shape appeared in the frame, roughly human in size and posture, but indistinct. Park officials reviewed the footage and determined that the images were likely caused by moisture on the lens or a malfunction in the camera's sensor. The cameras were repositioned. No similar images were captured after that. The Violet City area itself has a troubled history. In the 1920s, before the cave became a national park, it was one of the main tourist routes. Visitors would descend wooden staircases into chambers lit only by kerosene lanterns. The tour guides, many of them local men who knew the cave intimately, would tell stories to entertain their groups. Some of these stories were based on truth. One guide, a man named Walter Hudson, worked the Violet City route for nearly 15 years. He was known for his dramatic retellings of cave history, but he also spoke about things he had personally witnessed. Hudson claimed that on multiple occasions, while setting up lanterns before tours, he had seen a woman in old-fashioned dress standing near the edge of the bottomless pit, a 105-foot vertical shaft. Each time he approached, she would vanish. Hudson described her appearance in consistent detail. She wore a long, dark skirt and a white blouse. Her hair was pulled back severely. She never looked at him directly, but always seemed to be staring down into the pit, as if searching for something. Other guides heard Hudson's stories and dismissed them as embellishment, part of his showman routine. But in 1928, a tourist on one of Hudson's tours claimed to have photographed the woman. The photograph, now archived in the cave's historical collection, shows the bottomless pit area, illuminated by lantern light. In the background, partially obscured by shadow, there appears to be a figure. The image is grainy and unclear, as most photographs from that era are. Skeptics point out that it could be another tourist, a trick of the light, or a flaw in the film. But the woman who took the photograph, a schoolteacher from Indiana named Dorothy Crane, insisted until her death in 1974 that no one else had been standing in that location when she pressed the shutter. Hudson himself left the cave in 1931 and moved to Tennessee. In a letter written in 1956 to a former colleague, he admitted that the woman in Violet City had terrified him more than he ever let on during his tours. He wrote that she appeared to him over 30 times during his years as a guide, always in the same spot, always staring into the pit. He said he eventually came to believe she was searching for someone who had fallen, someone she had lost. Historical records show that in 1838, a young woman named Sarah Mitchell fell to her death in the bottomless pit. She had been part of a private tour group and had wandered away from the main party. Her body was recovered 3 days later. She was 22 years old. Whether the figure Hudson saw was Sarah Mitchell, no one can say. But the description matches the clothing styles of the 1,830 seconds. The bottomless pit remains one of the most visited features in Mammoth Cave. It is protected now by railings and barriers, but in the early days of tourism, visitors could walk right up to the edge. How many others might have fallen, their deaths unrecorded or forgotten, is impossible to know. The cave keeps its dead close, yet questions linger. Why did the shape appear only in that specific location? Why did it show up on 3 separate occasions, each time in a slightly different position, as though it had moved? The park chose not to release the images publicly, citing concerns about encouraging trespassing or thrill-seeking behavior. But copies circulated among staff, and eventually they found their way online. Paranormal enthusiasts analyzed them endlessly, though no consensus was ever reached about what they showed. In recent years, the phenomena have not stopped. In 2016, a guided tour in the historic tour route was cut short when multiple visitors reported hearing a loud crash from a side passage, followed by what sounded like someone shouting for help. The guide radioed for assistance, and rangers swept the area. They found nothing. No signs of a collapse, no one injured, no explanation for the sound. One of the visitors on that tour, a retired firefighter named Gerald Moss, later wrote about the experience in a blog post. He described the shout as desperate, anguished, the kind of sound someone makes when they know they are in serious danger. He said the guide's face went pale when she heard it, that she clearly recognized it as something out of the ordinary. Moss and his wife did not complete the tour. They returned to the surface and left the park immediately. The same section of the historic tour route has been the site of other disturbances. In 2018, a maintenance crew working to repair a section of handrail reported hearing what sounded like pickaxes striking stone, echoing from a sealed passage nearby. The sound continued for nearly 20 minutes, rhythmic and steady before stopping abruptly. When they investigated the sealed passage, they found nothing disturbed. No signs of entry, no fresh tool marks, nothing that would explain the sound. One of the crew members, a man named Vincent Brady, had worked in the cave for over 8 years. He told his supervisor that he had heard similar sounds before, always in sections of the cave that had once been mined. He theorized that they might be hearing echoes from the past, sounds somehow trapped in the stone and replayed under certain conditions. His supervisor noted the incident in a log, but did not pursue the matter further. Brady's theory, while unconventional, is not entirely without precedent. Some acoustical researchers have proposed that certain geological formations can act as natural resonators, capturing and storing sound waves under specific conditions. Quartz crystals, which are abundant in Mammoth Cave, have been shown to vibrate in response to pressure and temperature changes. Whether this could account for the sounds heard by Brady and others is debatable, but it offers at least a scientific framework for understanding the phenomena. Yet not all experiences in the cave fit neatly into scientific explanations. In 2019, a group of biology students from Eastern Kentucky University were conducting a study of cave-dwelling invertebrates in a section called the New Discovery Area. They were working deep in the cave, miles from any public tour routes, when one of the students, a young woman named Rachel Simmons, became separated from the group. She had been examining a cluster of cave crickets near a small alcove when she realized the others had moved on without her. Her headlamp was functioning, and she could still hear their voices echoing from somewhere ahead, so she was not immediately concerned. She began walking in the direction of the voices, but as she moved deeper into the passage, the voices seemed to grow more distant rather than closer. After several minutes, Rachel realized she was lost. She stopped and called out to her group. There was no response. The silence that followed was absolute. She had never experienced quiet like that before, a silence so complete it felt almost physical, pressing against her ears. She stood still, trying to calm herself, trying to think rationally. Then she heard footsteps. They were soft, barely audible but distinct. Someone was walking toward her from deeper in the passage. She called out again, assuming it was one of her professors coming back to find her. No answer. The footsteps continued, steady and unhurried. Rachel raised her headlamp, shining it down the passage. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating rough stone walls and a floor covered in fine silt. There was no one there. The footsteps stopped. Rachel stood frozen, her heart pounding. Then, from directly behind her, she heard breathing, slow, deliberate, the sound of someone standing just over her shoulder. She spun around. Nothing, just the empty passage. She ran then, not caring about direction, just needing to move, to get away from whatever had been behind her. She found her group 10 minutes later, sitting in a chamber less than 100 yards from where she had been. They had not heard her calling. They had not moved from that spot for the past 20 minutes. Rachel did not tell them what had happened. She completed the study, finished her degree, and has not returned to Mammoth Cave since. But in a 2021 interview for a university podcast, she spoke openly about the experience for the first time. She said she remains convinced that something was in that passage with her, something that wanted her to know it was there. Then there are the accounts that never make it into official records, the stories shared quietly among locals, passed down through families who have lived near the cave for generations. Stories of people who entered the cave and came back changed, who spoke of seeing things they could not explain, of hearing voices that knew things they should not know. One such story involves a woman named Evelyn Porter, who visited Mammoth Cave in 1989 with her teenage daughter. They took the standard tour, nothing unusual, but as they were walking through a section called the Methodist Church, Evelyn suddenly felt faint. She told her daughter she needed to sit down. As she rested on a stone bench, she heard a voice, soft and kind, telling her that everything would be all right. She assumed it was another visitor, but when she looked around, no one was near her. Her daughter had walked ahead with the group. Evelyn was alone. The voice spoke again, and this time she recognized it. It was her mother's voice. Her mother had been dead for 3 years. Evelyn did not tell anyone about the experience for over a decade. When she finally shared the story with a local paranormal research group in 2001, she was adamant that she had not imagined it. She said the voice was as clear as if her mother had been standing right next to her. She described feeling an overwhelming sense of peace, a reassurance that she had not felt since her mother's death. She visited Mammoth Cave twice more after that, hoping to hear the voice again. She never did. The Methodist Church chamber where Evelyn had her experience is one of the oldest tourist stops in the cave. It earned its name in the 1800s when it was used for actual religious services. A preacher named George Gatewood held sermons there for cave workers and their families. Records show that at least one funeral service was conducted in the chamber for a miner who had died in a collapse nearby. His name was Daniel Foster, and he was buried in the cave temporarily before his family could arrange to have his body moved to the surface. Whether Foster's body was ever recovered is unclear. Church records from the period are incomplete, and many graves from that era went unmarked. It is possible that Foster still rests somewhere in the cave, in a passage long forgotten. Some believe that the Methodist church chamber, a place where prayers were spoken and the dead were mourned, has retained a spiritual resonance, that it serves as a kind of threshold where the living and the dead can, under certain circumstances, communicate. Local folklore suggests that certain areas of the cave are more active than others, places where the veil between worlds is thinner. The Methodist church is one, the bottomless pit is another, but perhaps the most notorious is a section known simply as the Echo River. The Echo River is an underground waterway that runs through a section of the cave accessible only by boat. In the early days of tourism, guides would ferry visitors along the river in flat-bottomed boats, their lanterns reflecting off the dark water. The acoustics in this area are extraordinary. A single whisper can carry for hundreds of feet, bouncing off the water and the stone walls in disorienting patterns. Guides would demonstrate this by singing or calling out, letting visitors hear their voices return to them distorted and strange. But some sounds heard on the Echo River cannot be explained by acoustics. In 1963, a guide named Franklin Pierce was rowing a group of 6 tourists along the river when they all heard singing. It was a woman's voice, high and clear, echoing through the chamber. Pierce stopped rowing. The tourists fell silent. The singing continued for nearly a minute, a melody none of them recognized, before fading away. Pierce later reported the incident to his supervisor, who suggested it had been an echo of Pierce's own voice or perhaps a sound from a tour group in a nearby passage. But Pierce was certain. The voice had been female. He had been the only guide on the river that day. There were no other tours scheduled, and the song, he said, was not in English. The words, if they were words, belonged to no language he had ever heard. 2 of the tourists from that boat ride later sent letters to the park asking if the singing had been part of the tour. They wanted to know who the woman was, if she was an actress hired to add atmosphere. The park had no such program. The letters were filed away and forgotten until 1979, when another guide reported hearing the same singing in the same section of the Echo River, and again in 1984, and again in 1992. Each time, the description was consistent: a woman's voice, a strange melody, words in an unknown language. The park has never issued an official statement about the singing, but among the guides, it is accepted as fact. Some believe it is a recording, a sound from the past, playing itself over and over. Others think it might be something else, something that lives in the dark waters of the Echo River and sings to those who pass through. What are we to make of these accounts? The skeptics have their explanations. The cave is a place of sensory deprivation, where the mind can play tricks. The darkness, the silence, the isolation, these conditions are known to produce hallucinations, to distort perception. The human brain is wired to find patterns, to interpret ambiguous stimuli as familiar shapes and sounds. In the depths of Mammoth Cave, where every echo and shadow can seem significant, it is easy to see how imagination might take over. But the sheer volume of reports, spanning over 2 centuries, from people of all backgrounds, is harder to dismiss. Miners, doctors, tourists, rangers, scientists, they have all described experiences that defy easy explanation, and many of these accounts share common elements: the voices, the footsteps, the sense of being watched, the feeling that something in the cave is aware, that it responds to the presence of the living. Some researchers have proposed that the cave itself might be a kind of natural recording device. Quartz and limestone, the primary materials that make up Mammoth Cave, have piezoelectric properties. Under certain conditions, they can store and release energy. Could it be that traumatic events, moments of intense emotion, have been somehow imprinted into the stone? Could the cave be replaying these events, like a geological echo chamber? Others point to the cave's history of death. Lost John, the miners, the tuberculosis patients, the explorers who never made it out, Mammoth Cave has claimed many lives over the millennia. If ghosts exist, if the dead can linger in places where they suffered or died, then Mammoth Cave would be a likely candidate for such phenomena. The darkness, the stillness, the isolation. Perhaps these conditions allow the boundary between worlds to grow thin. There is another possibility, one less comforting. What if the presences in Mammoth Cave are not the dead at all? What if they are something else? Something that has always been there, something that predates human exploration. The Shawnee believed the cave was a gateway, a threshold between worlds. What if they were right? What if the voices, the footsteps, the figures glimpsed in the dark are not echoes of the past, but evidence of something that still exists in the present, something that inhabits the deep places of the earth? The indigenous understanding of the cave offers a perspective often overlooked by modern researchers. The Shawnee and Cherokee both spoke of the cave as a living entity, a place with its own awareness, its own intent. They believed that spirits dwelled in its deepest chambers, guardians of the underworld who did not welcome intruders. To enter the cave was to risk offense, to disturb forces that were best left alone. Some of the earliest European settlers heard these warnings and heeded them. Others did not. In 1797, a trapper named William McBride entered the cave alone, searching for saltpeter deposits. He never came out. Search parties found his supplies near one of the entrances, but no trace of McBride himself. His disappearance was attributed to an accident, a fall or a wrong turn in the dark. But local Shawnee who heard the story said he had gone too deep, that he had crossed into territory that was not meant for the living. McBride was not the last to vanish. Over the decades, at least a dozen people have disappeared in Mammoth Cave under circumstances that were never fully explained. Some were likely victims of natural hazards. The cave is dangerous, and even experienced explorers can make fatal mistakes. But others left behind evidence that suggested something more disturbing. In 1904, a young man named Peter Hollis entered the cave as part of a guided tour. Midway through, he told the guide he needed to relieve himself and stepped into a side passage for privacy. When he did not return after several minutes, the guide went to check on him. Hollis was gone. His footprints led into the passage and then simply stopped, as if he had been lifted off the ground. The guide searched for hours. Other guides joined the search. Hollis was never found. His family offered a reward for information. Local newspapers ran stories about the disappearance. Theories ranged from abduction to suicide to a tragic fall into an unmapped shaft. But no body was ever recovered, and no evidence was found to support any of the theories. The passage where Hollis vanished was sealed off after the incident, and it remains closed to this day. In 1947, a park ranger named Lloyd Ambrose reported a strange encounter while conducting a solo survey of a newly discovered section. He was deep in the cave, farther than any tourist had ever been, when he felt a sudden, intense cold. The temperature in the cave is constant, rarely varying more than a degree or two, but Ambrose said the cold was unmistakable, like stepping into a freezer. He stopped and looked around, shining his flashlight into the surrounding passages. In one of the passages, he saw a figure. It was standing just beyond the reach of his light, motionless and silent. Ambrose called out, asking if someone needed help. The figure did not respond. He moved closer, and as he did, the figure retreated deeper into the passage. Ambrose followed, but the figure stayed just out of reach, always at the edge of his vision. After several minutes, he realized he was being led away from the main route into an area he did not recognize. He stopped. The figure stopped as well. They stood facing each other across the darkness. Ambrose later described a feeling of profound wrongness, a certainty that whatever he was looking at was not human, that it did not belong in his world. He backed away slowly, keeping his light trained on the figure. It did not follow. When he reached the main passage, he turned and ran. He did not stop until he reached the surface. Ambrose filed a report about the encounter, but it was dismissed as a hallucination brought on by fatigue and isolation. He never led another solo survey. He retired from the Park Service in 1952 and moved to North Carolina. In a letter to a friend written shortly before his death in 1981, he admitted that he still thought about the figure in the cave, that he had spent 30 years trying to convince himself it was not real. He was not successful. The Park Service will not speculate. They focus on geology, on history, on the science of the cave. They remind visitors to stay with their groups, to follow the marked paths, to respect the environment. They do not talk about the voices. But the rangers know, the guides know. They have all heard the stories. Some have had their own experiences. They know that Mammoth Cave is more than just rock and water and darkness. It is a place where the ordinary rules do not always apply, where the line between the known and the unknown blurs. And so the question remains, what waits in the deepest passages of Mammoth Cave? What calls out from the darkness, speaking names, singing songs, walking corridors that have not seen light in thousands of years? No one has an answer, and perhaps that is how it should be. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved. Some places are not meant to be fully understood. Mammoth Cave has kept its secrets for millennia. It will likely keep them for millennia more. But the next time you descend those stone steps, when the tour guide's voice fades and the darkness closes in, listen carefully.